Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Today we're going all college basketball, and we're going to be moving into the idea of Caitlin Clark's legacy. And we do have a comment from Kirito that does, in some sense, sort of play into what we were just talking about in the last segment as well, talking about the fan behavior surrounding a lot of sports and the lack of class. He specifically was looking at sort of the disrespect that comes to Klay Thompson and people sort of getting on his case. We just talked about in the last segment as well the fact that Gabby Marshall of Iowa was receiving all of these types of negative comments to the point where she had to delete her social media. There is a real lack of class in a lot of sports fandom, and it is really unfortunate that that's the case. Again, the fact that it's spreading to the women's college game as well does sort of show to some degree the level of growth that the game is coming into. But at the same time, again, obviously it's so dirty, as you talk about. No, you're absolutely not the weird one for the fact that some of these fans are just so unclassy as they are. And I agree. I think that it's something that I'm not sure what the solution is necessarily to change, but it's something that we just do have to work through sort of and be diligent as fans to try and do whatever we can, whatever that is, to try and limit that toxic behavior that surrounds sports culture so much. But it's not just fans necessarily in terms of some of that, as we've seen with Caitlin Clark and the discussions around her the past few days surrounding the idea of her legacy. Now, her college career finally comes to an end yesterday with the loss in the championship game, and her career is filled with a tremendous amount of records. To name just a few, the fact that she's, of course, the all-time leading scorer in NCAA Division I history among both men and women. She has the single-season scoring record in the women's game, the most career NCAA Women's Tournament points in her career. She's a two-time Naismith Player of the Year, one of 10 women to ever win the award multiple times. The list just goes on and on. Practically the only thing that she didn't accomplish in her collegiate career was winning a championship. She made the back-to-back championship games without really all that much help from true pro-level talent around her, facing off in a women's game that has definitely seen some more parity over recent years, but traditionally has been pretty stacked in certain programs. Like we mentioned, UConn, the juggernaut that they've been for a lot of the program's history. And either way, the GOAT debates have just taken place these past few years. Whether or not you believe that a championship puts her over the edge, honestly, I can't say I know enough about the history of the game necessarily to definitively claim that Caitlin Clark is the greatest of all time. But we will sort of get into the idea of some of these former players and what they had to say about the idea of how important a championship was to her legacy and such. But I want to start with the idea of how Caitlin Clark answered the question about how she stacks up in her legacy, whether or not she is the greatest of all time. She was asked this question at the press conference a couple days ago leading into the championship game, and she provided, I think, a bunch of standout quotes that, in terms of talking about class in the comment section here, she had nothing but class, and also was able to sort of, have the bigger picture view that of the overall importance of what she's done up to this point. She said, quote, I've played basketball at this university for 4 years, and for it to come down to 2 games and that be whether or not I'm proud of myself, proud of the way I've carried myself, and proud of the way I've impacted people in their lives. She went on to say, I don't want my legacy to be, oh, Caitlin won X amount of games or Caitlin scored X amount of points. I hope it's what I was able to do for the game of women's basketball. I hope it is the young boys and young girls that are inspired to play this sport or dream to do whatever they want to do in their lives. She mentioned the growth of the sport, the way that people are respecting the women's game more than they ever have in the past. She referenced the viewership numbers, and she said, for me to validate myself within 40 minutes, I don't think that's a fair assessment. And honestly, there's been a big-time debate really surrounding the NBA this season, talking about who is going to be the next face of the league. And the quotes that Caitlin gave in response to that question about her legacy is pretty much all you could ask for from a face of the sport, where her influence clearly goes just beyond the stat sheet, the attention that she brings to the game, the inspiration that she gives to others that watch her. And, you know, it is more than just that too. I'm of the belief, and it's not the most popular opinion I feel like in the world, is the fact that professional athletes shouldn't have an obligation to be a role model. It's, in my eyes, kind of unfair to force athletes who are work their entire lives to play a particular sport, and because of their athletic ability make it to that highest level, and then sort of change who they are and the types of lifestyles that they live, and to make them be these outstanding role models. They're paid for their athletic ability, not how well they can speak publicly or handle certain personal situations. Now, obviously, it is far better for the sport as a whole when their stars are role models, and I do think that that's what Caitlin Clark is. You know, if you look in the NFL, I think Patrick Mahomes has had an incredible influence in the game of football in recent years as well, for the way that he does seem to be a very outstanding individual, and he's able to play the game at the certain level that he is. But, you know, I think that ultimately it's just been great to see the game of women's basketball grow. And I myself, like, I am, you know, no advanced expert on the game, but I now tune into these because it's, you know, a good product. And ultimately it wasn't getting, and now it's been an initiative for ESPN to try and grow the game over the past couple years, but it really took having somebody who was making threes from the logo and was consistently dropping 30-40 points to, you know, really catch the eye, because it's more so than just trying to elevate the game because we think it's the right thing to do necessarily in a quality. But now you have people who are actually showing, oh, Caitlin Clark, she is a bucket getter. Like, she can actually really play. And it's not as much of, and not that it ever was necessarily, but before it was just like, oh, it would be nice if women's sports sort of generated a higher level of excitement. It's fully authentic now because of the likes of Caitlin Clark, and she's not alone. I believe the 2020 recruiting class, what she was a part of, is full of future WNBA players. That includes Cardoso, who she just faced off against South Carolina in the championship game. Angel Reese, Paige Beckers was maybe in that class as well. I believe she was. And you had just so much talent that's now going to be moving on to the WNBA as well. That is really good to see. But for as much positivity as there is around Caitlin Clark, you also know that the sport is evolving when the critics start to emerge, and you have sort of the classlessness, as Kirito mentioned in the comment section, of sort of the way that fans talk about the game, but also, if you want to look at the NBA here, definitely a real parallel of when former players begin to sort of downplay what the newest generation is doing. That's how you know that the skill is really coming. And, you know, Caitlin Clark has not necessarily, for as much praise as she has gotten from some of the older generation athletes as well, she's had her share of critics as well, where the first example that really made noise was Cheryl Swoops, who was a multiple-time MVP in the WNBA, and a few months ago, she was on Gilbert Arenas' podcast, which, if you have heard anything that Arenas has said as of late, that's pretty much the birthplace of all bad takes. But she made a series of comments about Caitlin Clark where she said that Clark was a 25-year-old playing against a bunch of kids. She's just 22 years old. She said that Caitlin Clark, her scoring record wasn't legit because she had an extra 5th season of COVID eligibility, but she is just a senior, is choosing to forego that final year of eligibility. And she accused Clark of essentially being a shot chucker, saying she took, quote, about 40 shots a game, which, again, just sort of diminishing everything that Clark has done, and said that Clark isn't going to be able to dominate at this level once she reaches the pros. Now, she came out, she publicly kind of apologized later, where she said that she made the mistake of saying that it was Clark's 5th year as opposed to her 4th year. Other than that, she didn't really walk back any of her other statements. She did supposedly talk to Clark directly, and this is just in terms of, you know, what the situation is publicly, which not everything needs to be to the public, so maybe they had a deeper conversation privately, but at least I'm just going off of currently what we know about in the public atmosphere. And you've had others like Diana Taurasi and Sue Bird who have sort of downplayed Clark in certain instances. And most recently on Saturday, we had Lynette Woodard, a Hall of Famer. She spoke out at a ceremony. I believe it looked like it was for the WBCA, Women's Basketball Coaches Association. And she said that she didn't think that Caitlin Clark broke her scoring record. And she then walked it back yesterday on Twitter with a little bit of a clarification, an apology in bold letters, said Caitlin holds the scoring record. But all of this to say, it is just pretty funny how this all has played out, where older generation athletes, especially when you're talking about basketball and the NBA, there are countless examples there where they have always been very defensive of their era, and it's not anything we haven't seen before. I do feel like, considering the greater circumstances surrounding the women's game specifically, it is pretty lame to try and downplay this, you know, rising star that has brought the sport more attention than it ever has in the past, where you have, I believe it was Kelsey Plum who went on her, I wouldn't call it a rant necessarily, but she talked in depth at least about the idea of she wants the woman to be paid the same percentage of what the men are paid in the NBA, but frankly, the revenue of the WNBA in recent history hasn't quite been enough to the point where that's even necessarily a possibility. And Caitlin Clark is going to come into the league along with a very talented draft class here that now a lot of people actually know the names of. And I think we're going to see the WNBA really grow over these next few years. We saw the NBA back at the time of its inception. It grows exponentially. It takes name recognition and marketability to really get people to buy in and care. And that's why, to some degree, I think the men's game has sort of faltered in recent years because of the fact that there haven't necessarily been those stars that were box office like we saw, even towards the end of the 2010s. We just haven't had that same level of excitement around individual prospects. And again, it's not a massive deal or anything. I just did think it's just lame, honestly. Like I already said, it's sort of a lame move for these former players to sort of turn away the up-and-coming talent. And again, I understand there's a level of pride that they sort of want to, protect themselves and be defensive of all of their accomplishments. But I think that Kareem had the perfect response, really, to when LeBron James broke his all-time scoring record during the season a couple years ago. He used an analogy such as winning the lottery, and he said, quote, "It's as if I won $1 billion in a lottery and 39 years later someone won $2 billion. How would I feel? Grateful that I won and happy that the next person also won. His winning in no way affects my winning." And I understand it's sort of easier said than done. Also, when you're standing on a legacy like Kareem has, where he's acknowledged regularly as one of the greatest basketball players of all time. A lot of people call him the greatest college basketball player of all time, let alone all the success he had in the NBA as well. So when you've accomplished so much, it's almost in a weird way easier to be humble, specifically in terms of allowing in the new guard. But, I just sort of wanted to touch on this topic as a whole as well. I did think it was really cool of Dawn Staley to give Clark her props after the game when she was on the mic directly after the game, still on the court. She thanked Caitlin Clark for elevating the game of women's basketball. And really, that's what Caitlin Clark's legacy is all about, is extending beyond just the baseline to baseline, but it's about everything she has brought to the sport of itself, and it's really encouraging to see for the future here. I think that it is going to extend into the WNBA. You look at the idea of, well, what's college basketball going to do now? Because I don't think that it is going to, be breaking viewership records game in, game out like they just were, but we've seen the emergence of other types of stars. Juju Watkins, the freshman from USC, of course. Paige Beckers is going to be back at UConn again next year, and we'll see again what sort of plays out here with South Carolina as they continue to develop. But women's basketball is definitely in the best place it ever has been, and it is a lot of fun to see that we're getting this. Again, it's not necessarily a new sport necessarily, but it's a new exposure to the sport on a level that it never has been at before. But we are going to be taking our second break of the show. When we come back, we're going to be getting into the final four matchups from the men's tournament. We just had a comment from Kirito about Grant Nelson being out of Alabama. Curious if you want to help fill us in here as we sort of head into this next segment, whether that is probably the transfer portal. And Alabama's a very interesting sort of situation here. We'll probably get more into them even tomorrow in talking about the potential future of Nate Oates and where he could end up and whether or not he is in contention for this Kentucky job. But we'll get into the men's game momentarily. For now, though, we're going to be taking our second break, and when we come back on the other side, we will be getting into all of that. So stick with us. We will be right back.